A flight attendant disrespected a sleeping black CEO, but his son's calm voice woke him. "Dad, should I call the senator again?" The entire cabin went silent. He kicked a sleeping black CEO in the shin, thinking no one would notice mid-flight. He didn't realize the boy beside him had already learned how to wield influence. Subscribe if you believe disrespect always triggers unexpected consequences. The sharp impact came without warning. A sudden, jarring kick struck Dr. Kieran Maller in the shin, snapping him awake as pain shot up his leg like an electric pulse. His eyes flew open, disoriented, the dim cabin light streaking into focus as the engine's steady hum pressed against his ears. He inhaled sharply, gripping the armrest, his mind struggling to catch up with the violence of the moment. The air around him seemed still, as though the entire cabin held its breath. Brannick Vale stood over him. The tall flight attendant's posture was stiff, his jaw clenched, and his narrowed eyes glinted with something harsher than irritation. He hovered in the aisle like a man who believed he had authority far greater than the uniform he wore. His foot remained angled slightly forward, as if he hadn't fully withdrawn the kick, and the faint curl at the corner of his lips suggested he expected compliance, not confusion. Kieran blinked twice, his heartbeat steadying as he processed the attack. His suit pant leg was still shifting from the motion, the muscles in his shin throbbing from the blow. For a brief second, the world felt too close, the scent of cabin air, the faint vibration of the engines, and Brannick's looming shadow merging into a single, oppressive weight. Beside him, Leron lifted his face from the book he had been reading. The boy's eyes widened, reflecting a mixture of fear and calculation far beyond his 10 years. His hand gently touched his father's sleeve, grounding him. "Dad." "Should I call the senator again?" Leron whispered, his voice quiet yet crisp enough to slice through the tension like a blade. The whisper landed with an impact almost as strong as the kick. A few passengers across the aisle turned sharply, confusion tightening their brows. Phones hesitated in midair, half lowered, half raised, as people tried to decide whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something far more serious. The cabin shifted into an uneasy hush, the kind that forms when everyone senses a boundary has been crossed. Brannick froze. The confidence he carried a moment ago cracked like thin ice. His eyes flickered toward Leron, then toward Kieran, as if recalibrating everything he thought he knew. His Adam's apple jumped in a nervous swallow. Whatever justification he believed he had for the assault suddenly felt insufficient, and the certainty in his posture faltered. Kieran didn't speak. He simply sat up straighter, rubbing his shin with slow, controlled movements. His silence wasn't passive, it was sharp, intentional, and far heavier than any outburst could have been. He studied Brannick the way a strategist examines a board before making the decisive move. The unreadable calm in his expression unnerved the attendant more than anger ever could. Dramatic irony rippled quietly through the rows. Brannick saw only a man sleeping with his leg slightly extended, assuming entitlement, casual arrogance, or carelessness. What he didn't know, what the cabin didn't know, was that Kieran Maller had once funded foundational research that improved aviation safety nationwide. He had sat on committees. He had shaped protocols. He had indirectly trained men like Brannick to follow procedures they now disregarded. And yet, he said nothing. Leron's fingers tightened slightly on his sleeve. The boy leaned closer, whispering again, but this time more softly, as if testing the air. "Dad, he kicked you on purpose." Kieran nodded once, barely visible. His breathing slowed. His mind sharpened. Something was wrong. Something deeper than a hostile attendant or a careless act. Brannick's expression wasn't one of accidental overreaction. It was purposeful, charged, almost rehearsed. A man enacting a rule that no airline manual had ever written. The passengers sensed it too. The tension wasn't random. It was directed. Brannick's fists curled, the knuckles paling. His posture stiffened as if bracing for a confrontation he had expected but was not prepared to navigate. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words stuck somewhere between arrogance and fear. Kieran remained silent, and that silence became a powerful signal, one that shifted the balance in the cabin. It told everyone, especially Brannick, that Kieran was not a man rattled by a sudden attack. He was calculating, processing, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The hum of the engines felt louder now. The lights above flickered faintly as the aircraft adjusted altitude. A low murmur spread among the nearest passengers, subtle but undeniable. Phones rose slightly higher. Kieran massaged the point of impact, exhaling slowly, his eyes locked on Brannick with a calm that didn't match the violence of the moment. His restraint formed a barrier stronger than confrontation, one that unsettled the man standing above him. Everything had changed with that single kick, and the moment Kieran chose silence over reaction, the stakes rose, the atmosphere thickened, and the trajectory of the entire flight shifted toward something darker, something deliberate, something that had not begun by chance. Little did Brannick know, the silence was far more dangerous than a reaction. "Correct your posture," Brannick Vale snapped sharply, stepping closer with the air of a man correcting a rebellious child. Kieran Mallard didn't move right away. The sting in his shin still throbbed from the deliberate kick seconds ago, but what struck him more was the commanding tone in the flight attendant's voice, cold, rehearsed, almost too confident. He tilted his head slowly, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in analysis. No apology, no hesitation, no acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. Instead, Brannick stood upright, eyes flicking between Kieran and the galley behind him, his fingers twitching as if impatient to do something more. Kieran noticed the tremor, subtle, controlled, but definitely there. His silence, however, remained his greatest weapon. Laren, seated beside him, tugged lightly on his sleeve. The boy had felt the shift in the atmosphere, too. "Dad," Laren whispered, "I think someone in the back recorded everything." Kieran didn't look at his son. He didn't need to. He gave a subtle nod, slow and calculated, signaling two messages at once. "I heard you, and don't react." Around them, passengers remained hushed, but a few eyes peered over seatbacks and cabin dividers. Tension had a way of spreading, and this time, it wasn't being ignored. Brannick smirked faintly as if amused by Kieran's calm. He leaned in again, lowering his voice to a private murmur meant to intimidate. "Your name was flagged," he said, "on the crew roster." That stopped Kieran's breath for the briefest moment, but not from fear. No commercial airline would ever give roster access to a flight attendant. It was a protected, internal document. His expression remained unreadable, but his mind began moving like a machine. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. "I assume that's not a standard practice," Kieran replied mildly, his voice smooth but pointed. Brannick didn't respond. His eyes betrayed him, darting toward the galley door again, where another figure stood, slimmer, younger, clearly uncertain. The second attendant hadn't moved since the moment of the incident. His name tag read Darren Cole. His body was angled slightly forward like someone resisting the urge to intervene. Darren's mouth opened, but no words came. He simply shook his head, a tiny, desperate motion, pleading with Brannick to stop whatever this was. But Brannick didn't look at him. He was too focused on Kieran, whose measured silence was beginning to unnerve him more than any protest could have. Laron leaned in again, quieter this time. "That's not normal," he whispered. "Dad, that's not normal at all." Kieran exhaled through his nose, calm, quiet, calculating. His instincts told him this wasn't about a power trip or an angry crew member. This was something more coordinated, more dangerous. A chess match with pieces already in motion. He glanced down at his left wrist, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket just slightly. Beneath the fabric sat a custom-built timepiece, forged through a private partnership with a federal office that didn't officially exist. A tap sequence on its underside could trigger a secure transmission, one that bypassed the aircraft's standard communication systems and sent encrypted data directly to 3 off-site locations. It had never been used, not once. Until now, it had simply been a precaution. He didn't activate it, not yet. Instead, he shifted his leg slightly, the one Brannick had kicked, and met the man's eyes for the first time with full attention. "What exactly did that flag say?" Kieran asked calmly. Brannick blinked. The question had weight, precision. For a split second, the flight attendant's mask slipped, revealing confusion. Then he shrugged, brushing it off like a stain on his sleeve. "Just a note. High profile. Watch for non-compliance." A vague lie, clumsy in its execution. But now, Kieran was certain. Brannick wasn't improvising. He was following something, possibly even someone. The language was too prepared. And the glance toward the galley, that was fear, not guilt, fear of surveillance, or fear of consequences. Kieran's thoughts flashed to the emergency contact system embedded within the watch. Leron had mentioned it earlier in the form of a coded reminder. The senator, never named, always the senator, had made sure the system remained invisible but active. A favor repaid for something Kieran did years ago in another crisis that never made the headlines. This wasn't about cabin safety. It was a test, a trigger. Someone had flagged him for observation, and they had chosen Brannick Vale as the tool. The passengers still said nothing, but the silence had a new shape now. Phones glinted in hands. One man across the aisle raised his slightly, pretending to scratch his cheek. Another woman, closer to the front, tilted her head, catching the reflection of Brannick's aggressive posture in the cabin window. Evidence was being gathered in real time, and Brannick, too consumed by his role, hadn't realized the walls were closing in. Leron tapped Kieran's hand again, his young voice barely audible. "If something goes wrong, you still have the senator code, right?" Kieran didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His gaze remained fixed on Brannick, and in that moment, everything about his posture changed. Not submissive, not defensive, but prepared. The turbulence hadn't started with the plane. It had started with a kick, and whatever plan Brannick thought he was executing, it had just hit resistance far stronger than expected. Kieran decided the next move would belong to him, not the man who had kicked him. Brannick Vale's pacing grew faster, almost feverish as the cabin settled into a strange, unnatural quiet. Every few steps he jerked his head toward the cabin camera light above the emergency exit, checking, rechecking, as though he expected it to switch off or blink. But the light stayed steady. His fingers twitched at his sides as if clinging to some script only he could see. In the aisle behind him, more passengers had noticed his erratic movements and were no longer pretending not to watch. Cell phones began to rise discreetly from armrests and jacket pockets. First class had turned into a silent theater, and Brannick was the show no one had paid for, but couldn't look away from. Leron sat still beside his father, but his eyes were locked onto Brannick's shoes, their rhythm, their stops, their sudden lunges. He leaned toward Kieran slightly, his voice barely a breath. "He's watching the camera, like he's timing something." Kieran didn't answer, but his eyes sharpened. His objective evolved in real time. This was no longer about handling one aggressive attendant. It was about intercepting something larger. His thumb brushed the inside of his wrist, activating a barely visible node under the watch face. A soft vibration confirmed it. The embedded microphone was now live, sending encrypted audio directly to an external server. Somewhere far from this aircraft, secure servers had just begun listening, and they wouldn't stop until he told them to. Brannick suddenly froze mid-step and turned his head sharply toward the back of the cabin. A man in seat 3A, mid-50s, silver hair, brown sport coat, was holding up his phone, recording openly now. Brannick marched toward him. "Sir, I'll need to ask you to delete that footage immediately," Brannick snapped loud enough for half the plane to hear. "You're interfering with crew protocol." The man didn't flinch. You just kicked a sleeping man, he replied firmly, not lowering the phone. You don't get to bark orders anymore. Passengers murmured softly. The tone of the cabin had shifted. Brannick blinked, thrown off for a moment, then glanced down at his chest. His hand brushed the edge of his badge. That's when Laurent whispered, "Dad, his badge looks off." Kieran's head turned slightly. His eyes found the badge. Laurent was right. It wasn't just a hunch. The design was subtly different, less embossed, the serial number smaller, tilted slightly on the laminate. Someone had altered it, or swapped it, and no one else had noticed, except his son. Darren Cole appeared then, hovering halfway between the galley and first class, his face pale and drawn. He stepped forward, glanced nervously at Brannick, then looked directly at Kieran. "Sir," his voice caught, I need to speak with you. Privately. Please." His hands trembled. His eyes flicked back and forth like a man walking a tightrope with scissors thrown at his feet. Kieran leaned toward him, but said nothing. Darren lowered his gaze as if the mere attempt had taken everything from him. Brannick spun on him. "Cole, back to your post." Darren flinched but obeyed, retreating 2 paces, his face full of regret and hesitation. Kieran noted every detail, the sweat forming at Darren's temple, the stiffness in his neck, the faint motion of his foot edging toward the galley as though preparing to run. Darren knew something. That much was clear. But fear had him in a chokehold, and that fear, Kieran realized, wasn't caused by the passengers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom briefly, something about turbulence expected ahead, but Kieran barely heard it. The real turbulence was already in motion. Another light jolt rocked the plane. Drink glasses clinked. One woman gasped quietly. Attention rose in the cabin like static electricity before a storm. Kieran placed his hand gently over Laren's wrist, steadying him. "Are we in danger?" Laren asked in a whisper, brave but honest. "Not yet," Kieran murmured, "but we're not safe either." Brannick returned to pacing, now openly sweating, his gaze darting between the camera light, Darren, and Kieran, as if triangulating pressure points. His hand hovered near his waist, brushing against something in his side pocket, a cloth-wrapped object. Kieran caught the movement. He didn't stare. He filed it away. Then Brannick turned suddenly and locked eyes with Kieran. "You've been silent too long," Brannick said, his voice low but tense. "Makes people wonder what you're hiding." Kieran didn't flinch. Only people who hide things worry about silence. The line landed like a dropped plate. Brannick twitched. A ripple of awareness passed through the cabin. No one moved. Even the child in 2C stopped fidgeting. The oxygen in the room seemed to thin. Kieran's mind was already 5 steps ahead. If Brannick lunged again, containment would be necessary. Not escalation. Containment. He had already calculated the reach from his seat to the side table. The emergency call button was within elbow distance. 2 passengers beside the aisle looked ready to act. Still, he didn't move. He needed Brannick to believe he had the upper hand just a little longer. His son tugged his sleeve again. "Dad," Laurent said softly. He hasn't even blinked since the camera light came on. Kieran nodded once. He had seen this kind of focus before, not in airlines but in closed-door negotiations, where a single glance could trigger the collapse of a billion-dollar deal. Brannick wasn't improvising. He was waiting. For a signal. For a moment. For someone else? That's when the true realization set in. Brannick didn't just believe he was in control. He believed he was protected. Kieran's fingers tightened on the armrest. His watch pulsed once, still transmitting, still logging. But that wasn't enough. If this man was following orders, they needed exposure. And if someone had inserted him into this flight, this seat assignment, then this wasn't just misconduct. It was orchestration. Kieran took one final glance at his son, eyes steady and firm. He spoke low, so only Laurent could hear. "If he moves again," he said, We change the plan." Laron nodded, his 10-year-old jaw set like carved stone. Outside, the turbulence faded, but inside, it only grew. He knew the storm had not started with turbulence. It had started with a kick. The plane jolted with sudden force, rattling overhead bins and drawing startled gasps from passengers. Seatbelt signs flashed as the lights flickered and the intercom crackled weakly, an eerie backdrop to what was already becoming an unusually tense flight. But while most passengers instinctively buckled in, bracing for turbulence, one figure moved against the current. Brannick Vale, the tall flight attendant with restless eyes and clenched fists, advanced down the aisle, not toward safety, but toward the man he had kicked moments earlier. Kieran Maller did not flinch. He remained seated, upright, his gaze locked onto the approaching threat. But inside his mind, a cascade of analysis ran like wildfire. Brannick's movement was wrong. His pace was too deliberate, his expression too resolved for this to be anything spontaneous. And then came the sentence, quiet, but jagged like glass. "You weren't supposed to be awake yet." The words landed like a code fragment pulled from a broken program. Kieran's breath slowed as the implications assembled in his mind. Those weren't the words of a panicked attendant trying to cover a mistake. They were the words of a man acting under instructions. His objective shifted instantly. No longer was this about recovery from a kick, it was about control, understanding motive, preventing escalation. Brannick's posture was rigid now, arms slightly out as if bracing for an invisible shove. Behind him, the aisle twisted with half-turned heads, passengers watching with growing dread. Dramatic irony swelled. The man Brannick thought was vulnerable was not only fully alert, but already transmitting an encrypted feed through his custom wristwatch. Data packets pulsed quietly out of the plane, beyond Brannick's reach. Across from Kieran, 10-year-old Laron sat motionless, one hand gripping his seatbelt, the other resting on his father's arm. His knuckles were pale, but his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, tracked Brannick with a steadiness few adults could muster. Then Kieran saw it, a flash of reflection on the galley wall. A small, cloth-wrapped object hung just inside Brannick's front pocket, shifting with each step. Not a pen, not a tool. Something hidden, something prepared. From the galley entrance, the younger attendant, Darren Cole, reappeared. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched, and his mouth formed the faintest shake of the head. His eyes locked with Kieran's for a second too long. That tiny signal, subtle, terrified, spoke louder than any outburst. Kieran's thoughts turned tactical. He scanned the space around him. Passengers angled toward them, phones half-lifted in hesitant hands. The aisle was narrow, but enough room remained for Brannick to close the gap fast if provoked. The nearest armrest was 9 inches from Kieran's left hand. If needed, it could be leveraged as both defense and brace. The overhead bin above was latched. Good. Nothing loose. He calculated wind shear conditions based on the turbulence pattern. Light but persistent. No major interference likely on landing. All this flowed through him in seconds. And still, Brannick moved closer. Then, softly, almost too softly, Laron spoke. His voice was calm, but every syllable echoed across the sealed cabin like a challenge issued by a prince on a battlefield. "Dad, should I call the senator again?" Time stopped. Even the hum of the engine seemed to falter as every eye turned toward the child who had just pierced the veil of the moment with a line no one expected. Darren froze mid-breath. A passenger in 3B lowered his phone slowly, as if not wanting to disrupt whatever strange gravity had just entered the space. Brannick, mid-step, stumbled. Not physically, psychologically. His face drained of color as the full weight of that sentence landed. Because only someone with real power, someone dangerous to provoke, would speak of a senator mid-crisis, and only someone who had done it before would speak of it so casually. Brannick's gaze flicked toward Kieran's watch as if finally registering it wasn't an ordinary accessory. His hand twitched toward his pocket, then stopped. For the first time since the incident began, he looked unsure, unarmed. Kieran watched it all unfold without speaking. His silence was surgical, methodical, an emotional scalpel carving away Brannick's illusion of control. He didn't rise. He didn't need to. His stillness now held more command than any outburst could. The passengers sensed it too. Where moments ago they'd hovered on the edge of concern, now they sat riveted, watching the unfolding scene like witnesses to something larger than themselves. Darren took a step back, not toward Brannick, but toward safety. Even he understood the line had shifted, and in that pause, brief but seismic, Kieran felt it, the turning of the tide. The weight of fear, which had hovered like a shadow around his seat, now shifted across the aisle and anchored itself in Brannick's chest. The attendant's shoulders tensed, but no longer with aggression. Now it was defense. Now he was the one calculating. In that moment, Kieran understood that fear had just changed sides. Brannick steadied himself, breath catching as if he'd misheard what the boy just said. Laurent's calm, clear voice had sliced through the tension like a thin wire pulled tight. "Dad, should I call the senator again?" It was a question too casual, too confident, to be mistaken for panic. It wasn't a child's bluff, it was a signal, and the panic in Brannick's eyes said he recognized it for exactly what it was. Kieran didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had weight. He simply turned slightly in his seat and studied Brannick the way an engineer studies a failing structure, methodically, with patience, and with the understanding that collapse often begins in silence. Laurent's fingers rested lightly on his father's forearm, but his eyes remained locked on the man who had kicked his father awake without provocation. And now that man stood rattled, shifting from foot to foot, eyes darting to the galley like he was waiting for backup that wasn't coming. Around them, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Phones were still raised, some blinking with red dots, some held low in laps but still recording. Passengers leaned back into their seats, not out of relaxation, but in the way people brace themselves before a crash. Kieran's mind began linking things. The slightly modified badge Laurent had noticed. The strange phrasing, "You weren't supposed to be awake yet." The erratic pacing. The constant glance to the emergency light near the exit. And now, that subtle movement. The way Brannick's hand slid toward the object in his jacket pocket. Kieran saw it happen in microseconds. The trembling fingers brushing fabric, the shallow reach, then the halt. Brannick didn't have the confidence to grab it. He's waiting for something, Kieran thought, or someone. The cabin rattled slightly again as the aircraft caught a ripple of turbulence. The lights blinked overhead. Brannick rocked on his heels but didn't stumble. He exhaled, then turned his focus sharply on Kieran, as if trying to reclaim control by force of will alone. But Kieran just tilted his head and asked softly, "Who told you my seat number before the flight even boarded?" The question dropped like a stone into still water. Brannick didn't answer. He didn't move. His lips parted slightly, then closed. The pause was too long, too telling. For the first time, his authority wavered. Not because anyone challenged it openly, but because someone had asked a question that should never have been asked. Kieran knew it instantly. That silence wasn't empty. It was evidence. Brannick's jaw clenched, the knuckles on his right hand going pale where it gripped the back of the passenger's seat in front of Kieran. For a moment, the entire image looked like a staged photograph. Attendant leaning forward, father seated with calm restraint, son alert but silent, passengers frozen behind their screens. Only the low, constant hum of the engines reminded everyone this was real and still happening. A new figure approached, Darren, the young male attendant with downturned eyes and a mouth constantly caught between silence and regret. He inched closer, a hand shielding his lips from the nearest phone as he leaned toward Kieran. "He was given instructions," Darren whispered, barely audible over the engine noise. "But I can't say here. Cameras." His voice shook. Kieran didn't turn toward him but gave the slightest nod, just enough to acknowledge. Darren was scared, clearly, but scared people talk eventually. Kieran had seen it too many times in boardrooms, in crisis teams, in corporate collapse. The silent ones always broke first. But it was Brannick who began breaking now. Turbulence struck harder this time, a sudden jolt that knocked the cabin lights into a brief flicker. Brannick's footing gave slightly, his weight shifting unevenly. In that split second, Kieran moved instinctively, not to attack, but to shield. His arm crossed over Laren, securing his son against the potential fall of anything or anyone. Brannick misunderstood. His eyes flared wide, and in a sharp motion he lurched forward, grabbing the top of the seat in front of Kieran as though he meant to assert dominance, perhaps as a threat, perhaps to corner Kieran between seats. The cabin leaned forward with him, but Kieran didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly tilted his head again, just enough to lock eyes with Brannick. The hum of tension was unbearable now. Every person within sight could feel that they were no longer watching a passenger dispute. They were watching something calculated. And then Kieran repeated, slowly, with almost surgical precision, "Who told you my seat number before the flight even boarded?" He watched the reaction unfold, not in words, but in every microscopic twitch. Brannick's jaw tightened again. His eyes moved not toward Kieran, but toward the galley, then to Darren, then to the cabin lights, then back to Kieran. Nothing. No answer, no justification, no denial, just a paralyzing, terrifying silence. Kieran's heartbeat slowed. He wasn't afraid now. He was certain. There had been no accident, no moment of impulse, no misjudged authority. Brannick had been told. Brannick had come for him. Kieran leaned back slowly in his seat, brushing Laron's shoulder gently as if to say, "We're still in control." And in that moment, he understood something few people ever learned until it was too late. The most dangerous truths are not found in confessions. They're found in what a man refuses to say. The truth wasn't hiding in Brannick's words. It was hiding in what he refused to say. The lights flickered again, just once, enough to shift attention but not cause alarm. The aircraft dipped slightly as turbulence rolled through the cabin, sending a gentle shudder through the metal frame. Kieran Maller didn't flinch. Instead, he used the moment. He leaned in toward Darren Cole, his voice barely audible beneath the hum of the engines and the whispers of unease sweeping through first class. "Who assigned Brannick to first class?" The question was simple, direct, but Darren's reaction was anything but. Darren's eyes widened, panic flashing across his young face like lightning. He swallowed, glancing toward the galley where Brannick stood with his back to them, momentarily distracted by the shifting balance of the plane. "He wasn't supposed to be here," Darren whispered, his voice shaky but firm. "He switched rosters last minute, said he got a private message. I didn't ask from who." Kieran's heartbeat slowed. Not from fear, but from clarity. This wasn't random. The kick, the strange statements, the strange presence of Brannick in this section of the aircraft, all of it aligned in a dangerous thread now pulling tighter. Across the aisle, Brannick suddenly turned, eyes narrowing. His voice cracked the tense air like a whip. "You don't have the right to interfere," he shouted at Darren, pointing a trembling finger. Every phone in first class tilted higher, lenses aimed with a collective precision born not of panic, but purpose. The cabin was watching now, fully. Brannick's face flushed with a fevered intensity. The more the passengers saw, the less control he had. Kieran remained seated, still, hands folded over his lap. He didn't need volume. He needed precision. Every word now was a scalpel, not a sword. As Brannick's outburst echoed through the cabin, Kieran glanced down and noticed something on Darren's chest. A flicker, subtle. A small digital indicator pulsed faintly on the side of Darren's crew badge. It was a type of signal badge. Kieran recognized it instantly from his own security consulting work years ago, used in high-clearance zones and restricted research facilities. Why would a flight attendant on a commercial route wear a tag that needed embedded transmission clearance? The pieces started connecting in Kieran's mind like cold machinery coming to life. "Darren," he said slowly, "do you know what kind of badge you're wearing?" Darren looked down, then back up, confused. "They issued it after Brannick changed the rotation," he murmured. "I thought it was for the new scan points we're testing." But Kieran knew better. That wasn't for scan points. It was for surveillance logging. Brannick stepped back into the aisle, visibly rattled, and pointed toward the cockpit like a man expecting backup that wasn't coming. His gesture was theatrical, desperate even. But no one moved to support him. The cockpit door remained sealed, silent, untouched. Whatever Brannick expected to happen, hadn't. Then he turned on Chiron with renewed venom. "You boarded this flight to interfere with operations," he accused, voice strained, wild. The passengers collectively murmured, some audibly scoffing. The accusation was absurd on its face, especially given what they had seen. Kieran kept his tone steady. "Are you saying you have access to the passenger manifest?" he asked. Brannick blinked, too long. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The question was surgical. No flight attendant should have full manifest access, not in that way. And if he did, someone gave it to him deliberately. Darren's eyes dropped. He took a step back. Brannick said nothing. And in that moment, with silence louder than any defense, Kieran knew. He realized Brannick wasn't just breaking protocol, he was following one. Brannick Vale took a sharp step toward the cockpit just as the captain's voice cracked through the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now preparing for descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your—" But the voice, strained and uncertain, said more than the words themselves. It wasn't the calm authority passengers expected from a seasoned captain. It was off. Everyone felt it. Kieran Mallor didn't move, but his left hand instinctively steadied his son. Leron had sensed it, too. A shift. An unseen danger just beneath the hum of the engines and the flickering cabin lights. Kieran's grip was firm but reassuring. A silent gesture that said, "Stay with me. I won't let anything happen." Brannick, as if fueled by that same turbulence now jostling the plane, surged forward. His intent was clear. Get to the cockpit. Get there before anyone else could act. Maybe he believed that if he reached the captain first, he could hand over a fabricated version of events, paint Kieran as a disruptive passenger, or bury what had already been recorded. Maybe he thought the descent was his last chance. But two male passengers, one in his 30s with a crew cut and another in a dark gray hoodie, moved at the same moment. They stood up without speaking and placed themselves directly in the aisle. Brannick froze, his brows furrowed with confusion. These weren't security men, just civilians. But their message was clear. You're not going forward. A moment of pure stillness swept through the cabin. Kieran hadn't issued a word of command. He hadn't asked for help. Yet the entire first-class section now revolved around him. He had become the center of gravity, and even without authority, he had drawn allegiance. It was instinctive, human. They had seen what Brannick had done, and they had heard enough now to know something wasn't right. Brannick's chest rose and fell sharply, eyes darting between the two passengers and Kieran. Then, as if trying to reclaim control, he raised his voice. "You don't understand. I have to speak to the cockpit now." His words hung heavy, desperate, but no one moved aside. Darren, the younger attendant, visibly flinched and looked away, his conscience breaking through whatever fear had gripped him earlier. Kieran's watch gave the faintest pulse against his wrist, a subtle vibration. He glanced down just enough to read the discreet text displayed inside the inner rim. Ground Review Team notified. The secure transmission had been received. Help was already in motion. Leron leaned closer and whispered into his father's sleeve. "Will the three-letter office be there when we land?" Kieran didn't answer verbally. He simply nodded, a slight dip of his head. The nod was so controlled, so quiet. and yet something in it rippled through the cabin. Darren's breath caught. Even the two men blocking Brannick took notice. This wasn't just a father defending his son anymore. Something much larger had been set in motion. Brannick's composure cracked. His voice rose into a frantic stammer. I need access to the cockpit. This isn't what it looks like." But Kieran spoke for the first time since the descent had begun. His voice was calm, low, and terrifying in its clarity. "No one is moving until we land." The silence that followed was thunderous. Even Darren, who had been teetering on the edge of breakdown, stood straighter as if the firmness in Kieran's tone gave him permission to breathe again. The authority in that sentence wasn't from anger, it was from certainty. Brannick flinched like he'd been struck, and in his panic, he turned, as if to charge past the block in the aisle. But his jacket caught against the armrest of seat 1D. Something dislodged. A small, cloth-wrapped object tumbled out of his coat and landed in the aisle with a soft clack. Gasps erupted. The man in 3A, who'd been filming from the start, instinctively pointed his phone lower. The camera caught the device clearly, palm-sized, wrapped in thin gray fabric with a faint glint of metal showing at the edge. Darren's entire body froze. He stared at the object as if it were radioactive. Kieran remained seated, but his eyes narrowed, tracking every movement like a chess player spotting an endgame opening. He didn't reach for the object. He didn't need to. He was already analyzing it, its shape, its weight, the way it had rolled slightly and stopped. It didn't look like anything a flight attendant should carry. Passengers began whispering, some in fear, others in speculation. This was no longer a question of misconduct. It was something far darker. The act of kicking a passenger had now become the smallest part of the story. Brannick saw the panic in their faces, saw the judgment, and made his move. He lunged toward the device with a raw, desperate growl. 3 male passengers leapt into action. One tackled Brannick from the side, another grabbed his shoulders, and the third pulled him backward by his belt. The fight was brief but messy. Brannick thrashed and shouted incoherently, spouting phrases that sounded rehearsed. "I followed procedure. I followed procedure. He triggered it. I didn't. He wasn't supposed to." The struggle stopped when someone pressed a knee to his back, pinning him just beside the cloth-wrapped device. Kieran still hadn't moved. He hadn't needed to. The cabin had done everything for him. Yet all eyes remained on him, waiting. And then, without a word, he leaned forward and stared down at Brannick, not in anger, but with surgical focus. In that stillness, Kieran understood. Brannick hadn't lost control. He had revealed it. He understood then that Brannick hadn't lost control. He had revealed it. He smirked, convinced the attack would stay hidden, unaware that the CEO's son had been recording, calculating and preparing the perfect escalation. If you believe arrogance under a uniform always meets resistance, hit subscribe now, because justice doesn't sleep. The plane slammed downward through rough air, jolting every passenger in their seat as the lights above dimmed and the soft chime of emergency descent protocols echoed through the cabin. Kieran didn't flinch. His left arm stretched instinctively across Laurent's chest, shielding the boy while his eyes locked on the struggle unfolding just feet away. Brannick Vale, the flight attendant who had earlier kicked him awake, was now thrashing against 3 passengers holding him down, his body convulsing with frustration more than fear. His words came out in bursts, garbled and disconnected, like someone repeating phrases drilled into him in a back room somewhere. "You weren't supposed." Protocol response. Phase 2. "Engaged. Let me go," Brannick hissed as if defending a mission no one else was supposed to understand. Kieran's gaze lowered to the object lying in the center aisle. Metal casing. Small, matte black. Partially unwrapped from a tan cloth. It hadn't stopped rolling until it tapped lightly against the foot of a man near seat 2C, who quickly backed away in alarm. No one dared touch it. The cabin pressure felt heavier, but not from altitude. It was the weight of realization, something far more dangerous than turbulence had boarded this flight. Kieran rose halfway from his seat, careful not to block the aisle entirely, and knelt beside the object without touching it. He narrowed his eyes. The casing bore a familiar emblem, faint but unmistakable, a triple ring etched in silver, a prototype marking he'd once seen in a rejected communications jammer proposal submitted to his firm 3 years ago. That design was never approved, too volatile, too easy to misuse, and yet, here it was, smuggled onto a commercial flight. He inhaled sharply. Behind him, Laurent clutched his sleeve, voice low but steady. "Dad, is that what I think it is?" Kieran didn't answer. Words weren't what mattered now. Position, perception, and precision were. His objective had narrowed to one clear point. No one would lay a finger on that device before federal investigators saw it with their own eyes. Suddenly, Darren, the younger flight attendant who had remained visibly shaken throughout the ordeal, collapsed into the jump seat by the galley, clutching his chest like he couldn't breathe. His voice cracked through the hum of descending engines. "He told me," Darren gasped, pointing weakly at Brannick. "He told me a specific passenger had to lose his temper for the report to work. That's all I knew. I didn't know." His words trailed off under the shock of his own confession. Kieran didn't turn. He didn't need to. The pieces were already lining up in his mind. The altered roster, the fabricated confrontation, the suspicious badge, the device engineered to disrupt communication. Someone higher up had designed this entire event, but they had underestimated one thing: Kieran's restraint. They had expected him to lash out, to react with fury. Instead, he had recorded, documented, waited. Dramatic irony filled the cabin. Everyone could now see it. Brannick wasn't just aggressive, he was rehearsed. And Kieran wasn't just a passenger, he was the wrong target for the wrong plan. The 3 passengers holding Brannick struggled to contain him as he jerked again toward the object in the aisle. "It wasn't me. I just followed instructions. I don't even know what's in it." But no one moved to retrieve the device. Instead, all phones rose higher, cameras focused, lenses steady. Brannick had become the proof, not the authority. From the corner of his vision, Kieran saw the red toggle light on his watch flicker once, transmission still active. Data from the onboard microphone was continuously feeding to the encrypted server. He was buying time now, each second a layer of insulation against tampered reports or sudden malfunctions. Laron leaned in again, whispering through the silence. "Dad, you already won, right?" Kieran turned slightly, brushing his hand against Laron's wrist in a quiet reassurance. His eyes, however, didn't soften. They remained trained on the object in the aisle. "No," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "This isn't about winning. It's about proving the game exists." Behind them, a burst of landing gear echoed through the floor. The wheels struck runway with a sharp double thump, shaking the plane as oxygen masks rattled slightly in their compartments. A ripple of collective relief surged through the cabin, but not from Kieran. He stayed still, calculating. Across the aisle, Brannick stopped shouting and suddenly went limp in the passenger's grip. His breathing steadied, eyes fluttering shut before slowly reopening with eerie calm. Then, almost like a whisper that wasn't meant to be heard, he muttered, "They won't let you leave the terminal." Kieran's entire posture changed. He didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared. But inside, he understood something terrible. The real storm wasn't on the plane. It was waiting just beyond the door. In that instant, Kieran knew the real battle would begin the moment the doors opened. The aircraft door opened with a mechanical hiss, and immediately the mood inside the cabin shifted. What stepped in wasn't a rescue, at least not in the way passengers hoped. 2 men in gray and blue uniforms crossed the threshold with practiced, authoritative strides, their emblems marked with the cold precision of heirloom terminal enforcement. Not TSA, not airport police, private, controlled, the kind of presence that answered only to internal interests. Kieran's instincts screamed before logic caught up. These weren't responders, they were silencers. He moved in front of Laurent without hesitation, subtly shielding the boy as if it were second nature. All around, the cabin stirred. Passengers who had witnessed everything began raising their voices, pointing toward Brannick, towards the cloth-wrapped device now lying still in the aisle, toward the unmistakable tension that had followed Kieran like a shadow since the flight took off. But the officers didn't seem to hear them. Their eyes locked only on Kieran, as if rehearsed. Not even a glance at Brannick, who sat restrained and trembling near the front. One of them stepped forward. Older, taller, a narrow jaw and sun-wrinkled skin that made his nameplate all the more ominous. Captain Renler Vess. His voice was formal but empty of sincerity. "Sir, we'll need you to surrender your device immediately for review," he said, gesturing toward Kieran's wrist. Kieran didn't flinch. "It's already been uploaded, off-plane, secured. That watch doesn't hold the data anymore." A flicker of frustration flashed across Renler's face. Not surprise, frustration, as if the plan had depended on him not being that prepared. From the side, Darren hesitantly stepped forward. The younger attendant's hands trembled at his sides, voice barely rising above the background hum. Brannick acted alone. He wasn't following protocol. But his eyes betrayed him. There was more he wasn't saying, something he was terrified to admit. Renlor turned his head slightly toward Darren, not to acknowledge him, but to silence him. The passengers, sensing danger in the air, rallied without needing to be asked. They moved subtly, yet decisively, forming a loose human barrier around Kieran and Laurent. Phones remained up, recording, documenting every breath, every twitch, every move. When Renler barked, "Clear the aisle, this is a security operation," not a single passenger stepped aside. Kieran could feel it building, not just the confrontation, but the trap. Renler wasn't here to protect. He was here to extract and erase. Then, buzz. Kieran's watch vibrated against his wrist. He glanced down, careful not to draw attention, and read the message on the narrow display line. External oversight landing in 7 minutes. Maintain position. Relief did not cross his face. Only resolve. 7 minutes. All he needed was to hold the line until the real accountability arrived. No sudden movements, no escalations, just endurance. But Renler was running out of patience and time. "You're obstructing post-flight security protocol," Renler snapped, stepping closer now, voice louder, his presence meant to intimidate. "You'll hand over that device and you'll come with us for debriefing." "No," Kieran said with calm finality. "That protocol doesn't apply when oversight is en route. You know that." Renler's nostrils flared. The man wasn't here to argue technicalities. He stepped forward again, but this time with a pivot. He reached toward Laurent. Time froze. Kieran's body moved faster than thought. His hand intercepted Renler's wrist mid-reach, not with force, but precision. The grip was not violent. It was surgical, final. Every passenger gasped, not because of the movement, but the silence that followed it. No one in the cabin breathed. Even Darren stepped back. Kieran didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said only one sentence. "Touch my son, and you answer for everything you've hidden." Renler stopped mid-step, as if an invisible wire had snapped taut around his chest. The moment held its breath. His arm hovered in the air, fingers inches from the boy's shoulder, but the sentence that had just left Kieran's lips struck with such force that it rewrote the energy of the corridor. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like stone laid across velvet. Laurent didn't flinch. He merely looked up, unafraid, the same calm that had steadied his father now living in his bones. Kieran remained motionless, but every part of him was alert. His words still hung in the sterile air of the jet bridge. "Touch my son, and you answer for everything you've hidden." The recording phones caught every syllable, their lenses held with trembling hands behind the small crowd of passengers who now stood firmly between the private security team and the man they had just witnessed being assaulted, threatened, and provoked. For the first time, they weren't just bystanders, they were shields. Rendler's face cracked, not in defiance but in recognition. He had underestimated the man standing before him. His posture straightened, but not with power, rather, with someone preparing for consequences. His eyes darted to Brannick, still restrained, muttering broken phrases that no longer followed any rational script. And then to Darren, whose chest rose and fell like a man about to jump off a cliff he had spent his life circling. "Protocol requires separation," Rendler said, though the firmness in his voice faltered. "Passengers involved in disruption must be processed independently, for the safety of all." "Then start with him," Kieran replied, nodding once toward Brannick. "Unless you're afraid of what he might say when I'm not in the room." Rendler hesitated, jaw twitching. It was a calculated stall. Kieran knew that. But the delay wouldn't change the path anymore. The story had already left the plane. Dramatic irony surged through every inch of the hallway. Rendler believed he was containing a narrative. In truth, the narrative was already expanding beyond his grasp. Darren's voice cracked into the tension like a snapped wire. Brannick wasn't acting alone. All heads turned. His body trembled, but his eyes met Kieran's, locked in silent apology and resolve. He said someone from inside flagged the manifest. The tag came through an internal marker labeled S4-Delta. Kieran's breath shortened, but only slightly. It was a name he hadn't heard in nearly 6 years. A program so unethical it had vanished from all public documentation. A behavioral stress experiment designed to provoke, monitor, test, but never on civilians, never mid-flight, and never to involve children. "You understand what you're saying," Rendler barked, voice raised now, panic cracking through the surface. "You're referring to restricted internal research." "I know what I'm saying," Darren shot back, his voice steadier this time. "He showed me the tag, said Kieran Maller was flagged, said someone wanted to see if he would break." Gasps rippled down the corridor like thunderclaps in a canyon. Phones shifted again. The cameras weren't just catching images, they were absorbing truth in real time. Kieran took a step forward, not aggressively but with deliberate calm. "That program was shut down. I was one of the people who filed the internal ethics complaint. Are you telling me it was reactivated?" Rendler's silence stretched long, his pupils constricted. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. But in that moment, his stillness was louder than any denial. "You knew," Kieran said quietly, "and you let it happen." "I didn't authorize," Rendler started, but he was too late. The sound of faint airport alarms echoed from somewhere deep inside the terminal. It wasn't a fire alarm, not a gate alert. This tone was different. It meant external arrival, a signal, a message. Kieran didn't smile, but the shift in his eyes made Rendler take a step back. The passengers noticed. The air tightened again. Darren whispered, barely audible. "They're coming, aren't they?" Kieran didn't need to answer. Rendler glanced behind him, suddenly calculating a path out. But he was already surrounded, not by guards, but by witnesses. By people whose loyalty had quietly shifted toward the man who never raised his voice, never retaliated, never turned his back. A few more steps, a few more minutes, and truth would take the lead. And for the first time, Rendler realized he wasn't holding Kieran back. Kieran was holding him in place. Brannick's cry had barely faded when the secure oversight team stepped through the aircraft door. No fanfare, no delay, just 3 men in dark blue coats, each wearing silver-coated credentials that shimmered under the cabin's flickering lights. Their presence instantly fractured the illusion of order held by the terminal enforcement team. Captain Rendler Vest turned toward them with forced authority, attempting to assert control, but the men ignored him, brushing past without a glance. They weren't here to assist. They were here to take over. Inspector Calrin Voss led the group, a tall man with measured steps and unreadable eyes. He approached Kieran directly, cutting through the charged silence with one question. "Are you safe?" Kieran gave a single nod. "My son is. That's what matters." He then gestured subtly toward the small device still resting in the aisle and pointed to Brannick's chest, where the altered flight badge still hung lopsided. Calren followed Kieran's gaze, his features tightening. He raised one hand in a quiet command, and his voice, though calm, carried weight. "Everyone not listed as a passenger or witness. Step back now." Renler stepped forward immediately. "With all due respect, Inspector, this aircraft falls under terminal security jurisdiction. We have protocols to—" "Your jurisdiction was overridden the moment Flight 417's oversight channel was activated," Calren interrupted without looking at him. "Stand down." Kieran remained still but alert, watching the exchange unfold like a chess game he'd already mapped in his mind. Around them, the passengers stayed frozen in stunned silence, phones still raised, capturing what felt like history in the making. Dramatic irony swelled in every breath. Renler didn't realize he was already outmaneuvered. Foreshadowing twisted into revelation when Calren turned back to Kieran. The S4-Delta program was terminated 18 months ago. Oversight sealed the files personally. Kieran's jaw clenched slightly. Then someone broke the seal. Calren gave a slow nod, and they did it using internal override credentials. A collective gasp moved through the passengers, some murmuring in disbelief. The idea that a defunct program could be silently resurrected without regulatory awareness sent a ripple of fear across the first-class cabin. Kieran's focus sharpened. His objective had shifted the moment the oversight team boarded. No longer just protection, but full exposure. Behind him, Laron tightened his grip on his sleeve. Kieran gently squeezed his son's hand, then released it, stepping forward. Brannick, still restrained in a seat near the bulkhead, had begun muttering under his breath. His eyes darted wildly, no longer calculating, but fractured. Calren approached, kneeling beside the device in the aisle. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. "Sir," said one of the team members, "our database confirms this casing matches a prototype filed under communications disruption, never approved for use, logged only once in a shelved security protocol 6 years ago." Kieran didn't look away. "I reviewed that prototype. It was rejected for a reason." Then, like a cracked dam finally giving way, Brannick burst out, "They told me to wait until the lights flickered. The signal would drop. They said make him react, make him snap, and if he didn't, provoke him harder." Gasps again. Whispers. Phones rose higher. Renler lunged forward, trying to cut off Brannick's words. "That's enough. He's unstable." But Calren turned with precision, hand raised like a judge silencing a courtroom. "Captain, any further interference will be documented as obstruction of federal oversight." Renler froze. His jaw worked, but no sound came. Kieran stepped toward Brannick now, not to confront, but to understand. "Who gave you your final instructions?" Brannick blinked slowly, sweat pouring from his brow. "Jet bridge," he croaked. "Hidden channel, old network terminal, not traceable. They said you'd understand when it happened, that you'd try to stop it." Calren exchanged a quick glance with one of his men, who nodded and moved toward the cockpit. The tension broke into silence. Not peace, just the hollow quiet that follows the crumbling of a lie. The cabin was no longer a passenger space. It had become a courtroom, a vault, a monument to manipulation exposed in real time. Kieran looked down at Brannick with a blend of pity and resolve. This man wasn't the architect. He was just a tool. But tools still cut. Calren straightened and nodded solemnly toward Kieran. "We'll take it from here." And as the oversight team sealed off the forward section, recording every angle, every word, and every silence between them, the story changed once more. Kieran realized the kick was never about disrespect. It was a trigger in a larger experiment. The door sealed behind them with a low, pneumatic hiss, muffling the noise from the chaotic jet bridge. Inside the secured interview lounge, the lighting was soft but clinical, the air still with a sterile calm that did little to mask the tension. Kieran Maller sat upright, his posture composed but alert, as if every inch of his body was still tuned to the adrenaline of the last 2 hours. Across from him, Inspector Calvin Voss adjusted a small flat monitor on the table, scrubbing back through the security footage and personal recordings uploaded from Kieran's encrypted watch feed. The moment the wrapped device rolled into the aisle replayed again on the screen. Calvin paused it. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Same casing," he muttered. "Same shape, same soldering seam. That's not commercial grade. That's a scrambler." Kieran didn't blink. "Prototype. I reviewed it 2 years ago for an aerospace contractor. It never passed aviation ethics compliance. Too easy to misuse." Leron sat beside his father, small but steady, legs swinging gently off the chair. He clutched a half-folded emergency safety card, not out of fear, but out of a child's need to do something with his hands while his mind processed danger. Before anyone could speak again, a security panel blinked red near the lounge entrance. Renler Vess, still clad in his gray and blue terminal enforcement uniform, tried the access pad. It refused him entry. A short, buzzing denial echoed as Calvin raised his head with subtle amusement. "System recognized the oversight activation you triggered mid-flight," Calvin said dryly. "Your badge doesn't override federal protocol." From the other side of the glass, Renler pounded his palm once against the barrier but didn't argue. He backed away slowly, jaw tight. Calvin turned back to the room and nodded toward one of the aides. "Continue playback." The footage resumed. Multiple angles, Kieran's watch, 3 passenger cell phones, the cabin camera above the galley, all synced now into one sequence. The kick, the trembling hesitation in Darren's face, the wrapped device tumbling into view, and Brannick's erratic shouts, they unfolded with chilling clarity. The man from seat 3A sat nearby, arms crossed, watching silently. When asked to speak, he cleared his throat and said, "I saw everything. From when he kicked the gentleman in the shin to when he tried to grab that thing from the floor. I filmed the whole sequence. Time-stamped." Calvin accepted the footage on a separate drive, slotting it into the workstation with precise hands. Tension hovered in the air as Darren, pale and shivering slightly, stepped forward from the corner. His voice cracked. I didn't know it was this deep. I swear I didn't." He looked directly at Kieran, guilt flooding his face. "He told me it was an observation scenario. Just behavioral. Said we needed to provoke a reaction from one marked passenger." Kieran said nothing, but his fingers clenched for a breath against the armrest. Leron, sensing the change in his father's body, leaned over and gently placed his hand on Kieran's wrist. "It's okay now, right?" Leron whispered. Kieran turned, eyes softening as he looked at his son. He didn't answer. The real answer couldn't be spoken yet. Calvin opened a digital personnel file on the screen, pulling up an internal document with a redacted header. It bore the code S4-Delta, Behavioral Impact Metrics. "This list was buried," Calvin said. "Unauthorized, unmonitored, flagged during a dormant audit last year. Your name was on it. So were 3 others, 2 of whom had recent complaints filed after flying this airline." Kieran's brows furrowed. "That's not a random flight assignment, then. That's targeted placement." Calvin nodded gravely. "And you've been targeted because of your prior testimony in that regulatory reform case last year, the one that cost 3 executives their positions." Kieran's mind pieced it together faster than anyone could narrate it. This was retaliation, but cloaked in the language of psychology, dressed up in protocols and hidden inside a flight manifest. On screen, the paused image of the device loomed again. Calvin tapped it gently, then glanced back at Kieran. "If you hadn't sent that transmission from your watch before this thing went active, the comms blackout could have locked the narrative down for up to 90 seconds. Just enough for someone like Brannick to claim you got violent. Kieran let the silence hang. He wasn't angry, he was focused. That device doesn't just scramble signals, it scrambles truth. The room sat still for a beat, the weight of that line settling across every man present. No one argued. Calren finally rose and walked to the door. He keyed in a private code, ensuring the room's contents and testimonies would be sealed until federal review began. Then he turned and spoke clearly, firmly. This airline is now under immediate federal-level investigation. Every involved party will be interviewed, and those responsible for reviving this program, this S4 Delta, will be held personally accountable. Kieran looked down at Laron, who was now resting slightly against his side, breathing steady. The truth was no longer hidden on a plane. It was now documented in the hands of the right people. The cameras clicked. The microphones blinked red. And the moment the moderator tapped the podium to begin, Dr. Kieran Maller stood at center stage, flanked by Inspector Calren Voss, former attendant Darren Cole, and 4 male passengers from Flight 417, whose lives had unknowingly intersected in the sky that day. The auditorium lights were low except for the bright semicircle spotlight cast over the speakers, creating a sharp contrast against the navy blue backdrop embroidered with the Aerial Safety Bureau's insignia. No introductions, no preamble. Just Kieran, stepping to the podium with the weight of silence and the full attention of the nation. The cameras broadcast live across every major network. A small lapel mic clipped to Kieran's collar hummed faintly as he began. 3 months ago, he said, voice steady, I boarded a flight with my son, intending only to rest before a business negotiation. Instead, I became the subject of a covert psychological provocation protocol, one meant to test my reaction, exploit my silence, and distort my reputation. The room remained silent, thick with tension. Behind him, Calren's jaw clenched subtly. To Kieran's right, Darren lowered his head, his shoulders stiff but no longer trembling. Kieran took a breath, letting the silence speak before continuing. This protocol, we now know, was part of a covert network once known internally as S4-Delta. It was supposed to be dismantled 2 years ago, declared unethical, unfit, and unauthorized. But as we discovered, it didn't disappear. It went underground, and it followed me. The screen behind Kieran changed. Footage from the flight now played, a muted clip showing Brannick Vale lunging, the cloth-wrapped device rolling into the aisle, the passengers rising to restrain him. Gasps filled the room. Reporters leaned forward. The visual impact was undeniable. And then the most chilling footage yet. Brannick whispering, "They won't let you leave the terminal." That line alone lit up every live-stream comment thread. But Kieran did not flinch. We traced the signals. We tracked the data routes. And we found them. Not hackers or rogue employees, but retired executives with clearance, influence, and a plan to steer safety reform by orchestrating public crises. He paused. They wanted chaos, in the name of control. The moderator shifted nervously. One of the reporters from Channel 6 stood up and asked, "Dr. Maller, are you saying the incident wasn't random?" Kieran looked directly at the camera. It was calculated, and we calculated back. The room erupted in murmurs. But before questions could pile up, Inspector Calren stepped forward, presenting a sleek binder stamped with a federal seal. "This," he said firmly, "is the Sleeping Passenger Integrity Directive." He held it aloft. "It is now law." Applause burst through the room. Not polite, not ceremonial, but raw. Some reporters stood, others simply stared. Calren flipped the binder open and explained. From this day forward, no commercial airline may run behavioral studies, provocation programs, or observational stress tests without third-party ethical approval and real-time passenger consent. Devices used for signal scrambling, passenger tracking, or manifest manipulation are now classified as aviation interference. Kieran stepped back beside Laurent, who stood just tall enough for the camera to catch him holding a thin gold medal. "Courage and integrity," it read. Darren joined them, now donning a badge with the symbol of the newly established Aviation Ethics Division, a whistle in the shape of a shield. Then came the moment the nation had waited for. One final statement. Kieran moved back to the microphone, his voice lower now, laced with something deeper than pride. Resolve. To every passenger who stood up that day, to every worker who chose the truth over fear, to every parent who's been told to stay silent for the sake of peace, this is for you. What began with a kick ends with a directive. He turned to leave. Laurent walked beside him, medal in hand, his eyes shining with pride. As they reached the edge of the stage, out of view of most cameras, Laurent leaned toward his father and whispered through a grin that made Kieran's breath catch for a moment. "Dad, see, you didn't need the senator this time." Kieran chuckled softly, his fingers resting gently on his son's shoulder as they stepped into the soft halo of light beyond the stage. He had been kicked awake, but the country woke up with him. He struck the CEO and froze when the boy's voice cut through the cabin. "Dad, should I call the senator again?" If you believe real authority responds the moment innocence is threatened, subscribe now, because justice always has backup. The story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect in all situations.